My name is Ken McPhail. I have the immense privilege of being the new head of Alliance Manchester Business School. It's a great privilege to welcome you all to our first Vital Topics lecture this evening, a lecture series that was established over 50 years ago and has hosted many great and influential speakers over the years. This is my first Vital Topics, and I was determined to start in a way that signalled what I believe should be the future of business schools, and with a panel which I thought represented the calibre of the types of businesses, academics, and scholars that we want to engage with as we try to respond to some of the biggest business and societal challenges that we've really ever had to address. Of course, social responsibility has been at the heart of Alliance Manchester Business School since its birth. We'll be 60 years old in 2025. And in many ways, the rest of the business school world has been catching up with us over the past few years as we originally set that task to try and understand how business and society interact and how we need to get that alignment between economic value and social value working more effectively to address these challenges that we collectively face. So it does give me great pleasure to introduce today's topic, a nature-positive economy. It's hugely timely, of course, as we look to COP28, as that plays out, and we look at the discussions that are happening there and the commitments that are being made. And of course, the question for us is whether those commitments go far enough, whether that level of conceptual engagement with business's role in society has advanced far enough, or whether we're simply trying to pull what is a hugely complex problem into old-fashioned ways of thinking about business and economic growth. So as a business school, we are hugely committed to working together with business and society to tackle organizational transformation and get us to net zero. Hugely complex issue. I'm sure Paolo and the others will be able to unpack for us this evening. So as the demands on our planet continue to grow, you will all be aware of the new stakeholder on the scene, nature. So does nature have a stake in business? Should nature have a seat on the board? All topics which take us into the sphere of our conversations this evening. So it's a great privilege for me to introduce our speakers. Beccy Speight is CEO of the RSPB, one of the largest conservation organizations in the world. Beccy had that transformational moment herself when working as a management consultant during a 3-month sabbatical. Beccy realized that she wanted some more purpose in her life and has really set herself the task of finding out how we can collectively orientate our organizations, business and others, really towards that sense of purpose and meaning. While living in Edinburgh, Beccy joined a then small communication consultancy, CDL, sold to Omnicom Group. Her passion was people and effecting change, and taking, as she says, a substantial pay cut to join the third sector, she brought those two skills together in her first charity role as estate manager from a place that I have visited regularly. It's absolutely beautiful, Stourhead Estate. Since her early days of working with the National Trust, where she rose to become director for England, Beccy was CEO at the Woodland Trust, and since 2019, she has been the CEO of one of Europe's largest nature charities, the RSPB. You might hear a little bit more about Attack on Nature, the campaign in 2022. And Beccy believes that the RSPB has an active role and a bolder role to play in sustainability, climate change, food and farming, and much, much more. No doubt Beccy will unfold what that role is in her vision for us this evening. Simeon Rose. Various people have commented this evening on just how excited they are to have the brand director at Faith in Nature with us, the co-creator of Nature on the boards. My daughters have filled their bathroom with Faith in Nature, and I know it's in many of your cabinets as well. So it's great to have Simeon with us. He's had background in advertising, joined Faith in Nature in 2017, and has spent his time since reimagining what it means to be a green company in today's world. In 2021, Faith in Nature became the first company in the world to make nature a director. So we want to try and figure out what exactly that means and looks like this evening. Giving nature and the natural world a voice and a vote in all of its decision making. A good colleague, Paolo Quattrone, joined the business school here in April 2020. He is director of our Centre for the Analysis of Investment Risk. He researches two related big topics, which I'm sure he will unpack for us this evening. The first concerns how decisions are made under radical uncertainty and ambiguity, looking at the role that data visualization and governance mechanisms play in decision-making processes. And the second area of research concerns the notion of value. This is really what we want to grapple with this evening. What is value? How can we generate it? And how can we rethink the way that our business community works towards achieving economic and environmental value? So our colleagues will give 15 minutes presentation in turn to get the discussion going. I think it's Beccy, then Paolo, and then Simeon. That's correct, yes. Then after that, we'll be joined by Jenny Rose and Dougie Peedle. Just let me give a few introductory comments to both of those, and then we'll get underway. So Dougie Peedle, Head of Nature Positive Economy for the RSPB, with over 30 years of experience as an economist, working in both the public and private sector, and currently Head of Nature Positive Economy at the RSPB. And then Jenny Rose, another colleague with us here in the business school, qualified as a chartered accountant, working in audit with KPMG, and we really want to get what this looks like in practice for accounting and for auditing too. And Jenny is going to be leading us through the Q&A after our initial presentations. So please join me in welcoming our speakers this evening. Thank you very much. We welcome our audience in the room and online, and we look forward to a stimulating discussion as part of our first vital topics of the season. And over to you.
So listen, it's a real pleasure to be with you tonight, and thank you so much for coming out on a dark winter's night to talk about what might seem like perhaps a slightly dry topic, but I hope we're going to convince you this is absolutely essential to all of our futures. So over the next 15 minutes, I'll say a little bit about me and why the RSPB is interested in this, which might seem a slightly odd juxtaposition. And I hope I'm gonna give you some hope, actually, in what feels like quite a grim world. I've certainly just heard, on COP28, the kind of text has come back. It's not saying phase out fossil fuels, the teams out there will be working their butts off to get that to change. You know, the show's not over till Fat Lady sings, but, you know, it's not looking great at the moment on COP28. And I, as you know, as Ken said, I started my career really in management consultancy. I was working on big mergers. Back then it was kind of Diageo being created out of Graham Met and Guinness. It was Lloyd's TSB coming together. And I really loved that intellectual challenge and getting under the bonnet of big organizations. I mean, it's always fascinating. But really, when I got to probably my late 30s, I just had this feeling that I wasn't making enough of a difference to the things I really cared about. And that was, you know, the natural world and what's happening to our natural world. And that took me on that trajectory that's kind of ended up here at the RSPB. And I hope you all know, sitting here, that our planet is not in a good state. So, you know, there are some really profoundly worrying things going on. So, you know, here in the UK, you know, we talk about our green and pleasant land, but actually, you know, what's called the Nature Intactness Index for the UK, we're in the bottom 10% of the world. Now, some of that is because we had our early industrial revolution. We've been trashing nature pretty much ever since. But certainly in the last 50 years, there have been some really terrifying declines in biodiversity. And, you know, every 4 or 5 years, we produce something called the State of Nature Report, which is our scientists at the RSPB and scientists drawn from about 70 other organizations. They all pull their data. They all say, what is this telling us about the state of nature? And, you know, we just brought it out and it's really, really worrying. So, you know, we've got 1 in 6 species at risk of extinction here in the UK now. We've got huge declines in abundance. That's how many of something you are seeing. So if you think about once very, very kind of abundant species like sparrows, like starlings, they've all really declined in numbers over the last 50 years. We've got declines in distribution as well. So plants that you might once have expected to see in lots of different places, wildflowers, we're seeing in fewer and fewer places. So those declines are very real. And that really has happened in my lifetime. I really feel like I'm 56. And I feel like since I was born, we've seen those really steep declines. And I feel, you know, on my shoulders that I need to do something about that. But it's not just a personal and a kind of moral issue. It's not just about the intrinsic value of nature. You know, if you love nature, you want to hang on to it. It's all about really how those ecosystems as well really sustain us and sustain our world as we know it, in terms of how we go forward as a species. It's our life support system, basically, that we're trashing. And that doesn't feel like a very sensible thing to be doing. So nature provides the food we eat. It provides the water we drink. It's critical in the fight against climate change. So it's the other side of that climate change coin. You know, storing carbon in our forests, in our wetlands, in our salt marshes is a really good way of trying to tackle the climate crisis as well as the nature crisis. And the health benefits of being out in nature are becoming more and more known for our physical health, but also our mental health and well-being. That's becoming much more appreciated now. And there are more and more times now we are trying to put a value on that. We're trying to say, well, how much is this worth to us? And that's one of the things we're going to explore tonight. The Dasgupta review I should talk about as well. So hopefully you've heard of the Dasgupta review. It was commissioned by no less than our own Treasury, HM Treasury, a few years ago, and was a really kind of seminal report. And basically, Partha Dasgupta said that the economy is embedded in nature. It's not external to it. It's not adjacent to it. It's absolutely embedded in it. And that's increasingly being recognized. So people like the World Bank, the World Economic Forum are really kind of starting to recognize that. You know, the WEF estimates that 55% of global GDP is either moderately or entirely dependent on natural resources, including biodiversity. And biodiversity loss is listed as one of the top 4 risks to the global economy over the next 10 years, which doesn't feel like very long. So, you know, we can see that this is a real problem. So what do we need to do? Okay. So It means basically that we need to lift the lid on business. And what's interesting for me is that I feel as though my career is coming full circle. Having come out of that business world, I now feel like a lot of this answer lies in the business world. So kind of coming back into contact with that world, really. But the majority of businesses don't kind of take this into account at the moment. We've got some exceptions here tonight, but only 3 in every 100 UK businesses currently monitor nature and biodiversity risks. So that's a really low number, 3 out of 100, and let alone have any kind of strategy around what they're going to do about it. But we know that businesses can absolutely be the driving force behind nature restoration. So, you know, whereas currently some actions by businesses destroy nature, by bringing nature into their heart of their operations, they can really play a powerful role in doing something about it. So we need to move towards a kind of a net zero, but also a nature positive view of our economy. And the bottom line is that we have to undertake kind of nature restoration to turn this around. So it's no good just stopping the damage we're doing. We're going to have to restore some of that damage as well. So it requires a different way of thinking, a much more holistic way of thinking about business and about how we measure our success. So that brings me back to tonight, really, and why the RSPB is interested in this. So we're a pretty big nature conservation organisation. So you might know about us from something like Big Garden Birdwatch, where we get everybody once a year to look out of their windows and count the birds they can see in their garden or in their local green space. But we're much more than that as well. So, you know, we are backed by over 1 million members, and we have over 11,000 volunteers working with us as well. And we have a huge footprint in terms of our land ownership. I think we're the 3rd largest landowner in the UK, and we have 160,000 hectares of land that we are either owning or managing across the UK in the form of our nature reserves. But we describe our work really as splitting into 5 areas. So first of all is science. So we're really interested in science, and that underpins all the approaches we take. We have our own team of scientists, and that's absolutely evidence-based in terms of our approaches. We do a lot of work on species, so individual species, and trying to bring them back from the brink where we have pushed them as far as they can go. So something like a success story would be something like bitterns. So you may have heard of a booming bittern. That's the sound that the male bittern makes, and it's very distinctive. It's like being someone blowing over the top of a glass bottle, half full bottle. It's that boom. And actually, bitterns had almost completely disappeared from the UK, but they're now coming back as we've been restoring their habitat. They need wetlands and reed beds. And as we've brought more and more of those back, they have come back as well. We also work on places. So we work at quite a big scale on trying to restore habitat and restore places for nature. So an example of that would be a project called Cairngorms Connect up in Scotland. It's 200 square miles. We're working in partnership with 3 other organisations and individual landowners to restore a really big piece of land and get those ecosystems functioning as they should do again. And then we're also really interested in policy. So how do we influence the shape of policy globally as well as in the UK to really try and get the right frameworks in place for the systemic changes we need to get nature restored. And then finally, people. We're really interested in how people connect with nature and how we can make that happen. So in recent years, we've seen a step change. More and more businesses are getting interested in this arena and looking at how they can protect and restore nature. And some of them we are working with ourselves, and across the sector, there is more and more of a relationship, I think, with business. But can it really make a difference? Well, I think it can. So just a few examples in my own head. In Cambridgeshire, for example, at Ouse Fen, where it's a live quarry. So it's a live quarry. There's still extraction going on at Ouse Fen, but we're working with Heidelberg, who are the people extracting it, to turn that into what will be the UK's largest wetland at 970 hectares. So that's a very much a close working relationship. As one bit of the site is vacated, we will come in and help restore it and create basically what is an amazing new wetland. And, you know, nature and business may feel like odd bedfellows, but, you know, and nature and development in particular, but we're also working with Barratt's, who are a housing developer. And we work with them to do a number of things, to kind of really look at things like the creation of their gardens. Can they be as nature friendly as possible? Looking at the installation of Swift bricks. You might have seen there's been a lot of fuss on social media. We've been supporting a campaigner recently around Swift bricks, so getting those put into new developments, and also working on things like the changes towards biodiversity net gain, which are due to come in late, early next year. So kind of really working with developers as well. And I'm sure Simeon is going to give great examples of what a business can do around the nature agenda. But, you know, we've got to go further and we've got to go faster. If I don't leave you with anything else today, that would be my big message. So, you know, this is a time, I think, for radical collaborations. One of the things we've said in the RSPB is that in this decade, out to 2030, we've got to do more at scale. We've got to do deeper collaborations. And I think the state of nature absolutely showed us how urgent that is. So, you know, this is a time when we need to break those happen. And, you know, we are here, as are others in the sector, to work with businesses to make all of this possible. You know, the UK is home to some of the most spectacular species on Earth. So I don't know if you saw kind of Wild Isles, the series that we helped co-produce with WWF and the Open University earlier this year, which really showed how spectacular the species in the UK can be. And we just kind of, we're pushing them to the brink, basically. We're in the stage now where we really are pushing those species to the brink. But there absolutely is hope. And I'm going to leave you with this thought, really, to imagine a world where we no longer see nature as a place to visit, but as a place where we live, and where our skies are filled with birdsong, our towns and cities are lined with trees, and we breathe in cleaner, safer air. You know, the future is possible. The future can be better. If everyone in this room and online, you know, could take nature back into their workspace, then there is a future in which all of our pension funds not only give us the security of our own future, but the future of the planet as well, and where our families and generations to come, you know, thinking about those future generations, will know what a hedgehog looks like, not from TV, but because they've actually seen one in their own garden. So, you know, this is what the future should look like, a healthy, resilient world where nature thrives, and so do we. So my final call to you today is, if you care about nature and you're worried at all about its collapse, and believe me, you should be, then use your voice and use your influence. Step into your agency to make a difference where you work, where you interact. And you have that power to kind of start that revolution running. You can do it more quickly than any politician. You can talk to your colleagues, your manager, and everyone to find out where you should start. But there is an absolute future where business can play a really important role. So, you know, to borrow a phrase from one of our ambassadors, who is the entrepreneur and dragon, Deborah Meaden, she said, "I'm not worried that we don't know how to change course. I'm worried that we won't do it in time." And that's down to all of us. Thank you.
I go? Okay, so good evening, everyone. I have a very difficult task tonight, which is to make you change your perspective about accounting from something that is boring to something that actually can save the world. And I have to do that in 15 minutes. Okay, so that's it. Okay, that's me, Paolo Quattrone, and I'll be talking about research that I've done with some colleagues from Bocconi University and the University of Siena. If you look at what is happening in the field of financial reporting and reporting more in general, what we're witnessing is the enlargement of the realm of what gets measured. So we've got finance, and then on top of that, then we have got societal issues and then environmental issues. So we're moving from financial reporting to ESGs and SDGs. I'm not convinced that this is the right way of moving forward. I'll tell you why. So there are basically financial measures on one side, and then other set of measures that are developed for understanding how corporations deal with societal issues and with natural issues. And I'm not entirely sure that this dichotomy between the two is a good thing. I'll give you an anecdote more than anything else to convince you that this is a good insight. So a few years ago, I was doing some, was preparing some lectures for Oxford, where I worked a few years ago, and I was looking at the Global Reporting Initiative and how firms that were following these guidelines prepared their report. And I was attracted by one quite large food chain. They sell burgers. You can imagine, you know, there are not many. This is very big, okay? And they were preparing the report on whether the food that they serve was good for the public, for society, for the customers who entered their shops in the chain that they own worldwide. And one of the measures that they came up with to understand whether the quality of the food was good or not was the average calories intake of the menu that they offered in these chains, which is an interesting way of measuring the quality of the food, because you may not think about that, but measures are, I mean, measuring things, measuring value, Ken was saying earlier, is a very complicated thing. And so quality of food could be measured in many different ways. And so the average calories intake of the menu is one of those. And they prepared the reports according to that, and they were showing that their average calories intake was good. Why was good? Because they had put in the menu of the restaurant salads, which puts the calories intake of that menu down. Not many people realize that this big corporation was also funding the Global Reporting Initiative that was defining the measures that had to be adopted in reporting about the activities that these corporations do. Most of the current initiatives that you see on this screen are actually funded by the companies that then will have to report according to the regulations and policies that these initiatives will generate. And of course, being numbers not always objective, they leave cracks, and then politics, lobbying, and all of these things enter the cracks. I'm a bit against that idea. We were commenting before coming here that at COP28, the largest number of participants were lobbyists. And so in the imperfection of measurement, all of these lobbyists try to define the way in which things are measured in a way that is interesting for them, not interesting for or in the interest of the public. So I had an idea that I think is quite simple and I would say relatively elegant. So when I was a student, I'm Italian, as you can see from my accent and from my surname, maybe. When I was a student in Italy doing undergraduate studies, we studied at least 6 different formats of income statement. Nowadays, we are only used to 1, maximum 2, where the focus is on shareholders' value and on profit. That is only one of the possible ways in which an income statement can be organized. When I was a student, there was, of course, last century, but not at the beginning of that last century. So it was last century, but 1980. So we're not talking about decade, you know, a few decades ago. One structure of the income statement was not based on profit, so it did not have one specific focus. It was afocal or it was polyfocal, so it had multiple foci of attention. And this was based on value added. So it was trying to, so that income statement tries to understand how the activity of firms and corporations create value, and then how this value is distributed among different stakeholders. And so you would have salaries that go to employees and reward human capital. You would have interest and dividends that reward and remunerate financial capital. Then you will have taxes that remunerate another important stakeholder, which is the state that produces or offers or provides infrastructures thanks to which we can operate and do business. And then, of course, through return earnings, there will be also the remuneration of the firm. There is the institution where all this continuous mediation between the production and distribution of value happens. My idea was very simple. Why don't we add another line to this income statement and we create a provision for nature, which would recognize nature as a stakeholder at the same level of the other human stakeholders. It's interesting to reflect that there are three production factors when you look at this from an economics point of view. One is financial capital, and we remunerate that with interest and dividends. One is human capital, and we remunerate that with salaries. One is natural capital, and we do not remunerate it. So the only thing that we do is to exploit nature in the name of economic value. So a very small change in the income statement, an income statement that was actually part of the fourth European directive, the first attempt of standardized accounts in Europe. There were two options: the Anglo-American, which is based on profit, and the continental, which is based instead on value added. The continent has lost the battle, and we should ask ourselves why and how. But if we go back to that, just that line creates at least two effects. So the first one is to make sure that we make visible how we regenerate capital. The second, to force corporations to disclose their policies on what they do in relation to the regeneration of natural capital. That red provision there could also be zero. The company say I don't care about nature. Okay, I'm perfectly fine with the way in which I am. But then the public and the market will make their mind about whether this is a right policy or not. So a provision that will create then in the balance sheet a fund for nature, and it becomes an instrument of reflection. Interestingly enough, in this research, we found only two companies, one that thought about doing this and one that did this. So one was a large German corporation that is audited according to IFRS, and they had an enlightened CFO, and he wanted to move towards this structure. But the auditor said, this is not possible according to international financial reporting standards, because that contingency would not be material, would not affect the interests of stakeholders. An Italian company that works in the north of Italy, which is a public utility, which is regulated differently, which does not have to report according to IFRS, does or produces income statements in that way. The other thing that we could also do then, because accounting is a fantastic way of understanding not only value chains, so how value is produced and distributed, but also to link that to supply chains. And so what we could do is then to create a space to understand how each line of that income statement, for instance, affects the SDGs. So how do I, in producing my services and my goods, am I contributing to the reduction of poverty, where I'm doing that, and so forth and so on. So I have my beloved colleague here who's saying, Paolo, end. And so I am ending. We can also think about the interrelation between these things. I have to thank CIMA and AICPA for having sponsored this research, but I hope that in 15 minutes I convinced you that accounting can save the world. If you're interested, hashtag accounting can save the world, and there is a nice website and you can visit it, and there is also the report for AICPA that has been published last week. So thank you very much.
Hi everyone, I'm Simeon Rose. I'm brand director at Stakeholder. And there's lovely being here in Manchester talking about this, right? Because I've got this all over the place, lots of people everywhere. And never have spoken in Manchester to a Manchester audience about something that happened just down the road in Manchester. For those of you who don't know, natural products, soaps, shampoos, that sort of thing. And we make you feel bad. And from Dale Street. So it's lovely being here. We're almost started really. And I think telling that we start with this word us is actually where so much of this stuff started. Us asking me asking certain questions. You know, actually, and that's, there was naivety in there, certainly. But also just this sense that perhaps we need to be asking greater questions.
Yeah, am I right? Is that better?
That works, yeah.
Okay,
Yeah,
hopefully some of you heard at least some of that. All right, cool. So Faith in Nature asks, how might business change if nature had a voice and a vote? That's where all this started. We didn't just wake up one day wondering that. It was an evolution, and we got to that point eventually. Obviously, we had a will, but no real way of answering it. So we asked those questions of people that did know how, you know, whether or not there was an answer to it. Lawyers for Nature and Earth Law Centre, I didn't know them. I just knew the work that they were doing, and the work that they were doing was incredible. Environmental lawyers, lawyers really drawing up what the rights of nature mean. And their response initially was, I think perhaps, let's say there was some skepticism, but it was wonderful. You know, you call up these guys, and they'd been asking questions like that themselves of governments, of politicians, of councils, and getting nowhere, at least in the UK. Earth Law Centre were doing slightly better. They were working with Panama and other Central American countries to create constitutions around the rights of nature at a national level. But certainly in the UK, we're a long way off. So when a business calls up those guys and says, can we give nature a voice and a vote in what we're doing? I think there was a moment for them when I thought, actually, this is incredible because businesses can move so quickly. Paul Powsland at Lawyers for Nature, once he'd gotten over the skepticism, started really talking to me about all this and just saying why this was so wonderful. Actually, companies have legal rights, as humans have legal rights. Trees, and companies, by the way, are set up within about half an hour at company's house. Trees that may have stood for 500 longer years have no rights whatsoever. Paul at the time was defending a tree just down the road from where I lived in Hackney, and that was my only link to him. But he jumped at this anyway. So that led to this, which I know we've already touched on. In 2021, we became the first company in the world to give nature a voice and a vote. And that line at the end was really important, but we don't want to be the last. That led to articles like this. In The Guardian, this is the one that went the furthest. Eco beauty company appoints nature to its board of directors. Misquoted us as being Edinburgh-based. We're not Manchester-based, but anyway. Should you put nature on your board of management? The short answer is yes. And then pieces from us elsewhere about why we've done it. And actually, it's the why we've done it that is so important here. But first of all, I think a little bit of context. What led to this idea? Well, that's Rivka, my stepmom. That's her in the 70s in the kitchen making, natural soaps and shampoos. And I heard some, ESG and SDGs earlier. I was actually on a call the other day with my dad, and someone mentioned these acronyms, and he put up his hand and said, "What is ESG?" And I love that actually, because it's sort of like, for him, this is all about just doing things from the heart and doing what he believed was right necessarily, rather than doing things according to business models, etc., etc. Anyway, so a family link, and I started working together with my creative partner, Anne, at Faith in Nature about 8 years ago, proper, after a career in advertising creatives. And so it's quite quick, actually, to get to an articulation of what the company really meant, because obviously we knew Rivka so well. And her belief is that nature, she was never the one in control. She was the founder, but it was always nature that was the boss. So we got to that idea quite quickly, wrote those words, on the boardroom wall, and that was meant to be just a filter. You know, if ever you're in doubt what to do, just return to this idea that nature is the boss. And actually, when you start like integrating that, you're halfway there, more than halfway there. And so we started with packaging and the aesthetics, the superficial stuff, going, well, if nature is the boss, what would we look like? And first entry into that was, well, what if nature was your creative director? What would you look like? Look out the window, nature looks a bit mad. At the time, everything in the natural eye was polite, let's say, or boring. But nature doesn't look like that. That was our first foray into sort of thinking this way, in a formalized way. And then one thing at a time, we just kept going, okay, like, never mind the creative direction, never mind the looks of things. What if nature was really the boss? What if, what if, what if? And then there was my partner, Anne, you know, we were wandering again. I now live in West Wales, and some people say, oh, you know, you must walk in the mountains and have these thoughts. We were just walking around our streets in Hackney. And Anne said, what if nature really was the boss? And it was at that moment that I was like, that, you know, as creative teams or as creatives, we hear a lot of each other's ideas and are quick to tell each other that each other's ideas are terrible often. But I just, you know, it was a beautiful question. And that then led to all these other questions, right? Actually, we really started looking at our position on the board. That even that question itself came from realizing that we were now being asked all these different questions. By this point, Anne and I were both on the board and wondering how we're meant to answer questions such as what ingredients we should use, what packaging, et cetera, because we're from advertising backgrounds. How are we meant to know? Also, the realization that it doesn't matter what we do, everything has an impact on the natural world, all of it. So, you know, whether we recognize nature as a stakeholder or not, nature is a stakeholder, perhaps the biggest stakeholder. And when that penny really dropped, it was like, okay, we really need to do something about this and figure it out, because it's not a case of what the best option is. Often it's just the least worst. And who are we to make that call? It was, you know, outside of that, we were becoming increasingly interested in all this rights of nature work. You know, the River Wanganui was granted legal personhood in New Zealand. That's the most famous thing, case study rather. Earth Law Centre, who I mentioned earlier, they were the legal team behind that. The UK examples here, Lawyers for Nature were the legal team behind that. That's why we just approached them. There was no other link. We just sort of saw the work that we thought most inspiring. And what that means is, you know, if you imagine the story of human rights, the story of the rights we tell ourselves companies have, etc., the story of nature's rights are broadly that it has none, but it definitely should have. And I think when we start recognizing nature or rivers as legal persons, then other questions arise, such as, well, if such a river is polluted, shouldn't it get to sue those who pollute it, etc. Fascinating stuff. Grant Wilson of Earth Law Centre, when we approached him, this was his quote on the whole thing: the movement for the rights of nature is picking up momentum across the world, but businesses have been slow to recognize that they're a crucial part of this story. Making nature as a director is a tangible step that businesses can take to ensure that their operations take into account the rights and needs of the natural world. And what is incredible, actually, I mean, I agree completely that the business has a huge role to play in this, whereas governments, whereas politicians might take forever getting around to this way of thinking. Businesses, if businesses want to, can change overnight, more or less, because we write our own mini constitutions in our own articles. So, you know, if we want to make changes and impose those changes upon ourselves and act as if nature has rights, which is fundamentally all the story of rights is anyway, we can do. So how does it work? 4 key bits I want to just touch on, and I have, as I say, zero background in the law, so I've just absorbed a lot from Paul and Bronte and everybody involved in this. But first bit to understand here is the guardianship model, and the easiest way to understand that is to imagine a child having to go to court, and a child can't represent themselves, so therefore a responsible adult has to speak on their behalf. It's exactly the same with a lot of the rights of nature work, and actually it's quite poignant because the vulnerable child is nature needing us to speak on its behalf. Independence and accountability. So nature, as a director or the guardians, are not employed by Faith in Nature. They're completely external, and they come in and they are completely independent of us, and we're accountable to them. Purpose clause. So within our articles, Bronte amended our purpose, so we don't just exist for the shareholders essentially. We also exist for the protection of the natural world. That's now like legally embedded in why we're there. And no other companies, to my knowledge, have inserted a purpose clause in their articles in about the last 100 years in the UK. But it's there, you know, there's a big creative space within which we can start to reimagine what companies are. And at the end of all this, nature, as represented by its guardians, has an equal vote to everybody else. So more questions always arise at this point, and actually the questions keep coming up. We haven't answered this. We're just at the beginning of finding our way to, you know, towards perhaps towards a way of answering these even. Who speaks for nature is a big one, always. And currently, it's the environmental lawyers who created the systems. You know, the system is so new that Bronte from Lawyers for Nature and Ali until recently from Earth Law Centre, they were the guardians. Nature as a director is a single entity. The non-human entity that is nature is the named director, but as many guardians as necessary can speak on its behalf. Those guardians, they're really just mouthpieces and conduits. They have access to as wide a network of other experts as needed to bring forward whatever insight and perspective we need. And that's actually the whole point of this, to bring perspectives to a boardroom table that have just never been there before. What changes have you seen? Well, if you want to read the full thing, that's just published last week. That's our one-year report, and that's actually part of the deep design of Nature on the Board to ensure full accountability, essentially. Everything is minuted longhand, and there's chance for reflection and complete transparency. Essentially, in terms of actual changes, I think it's fair to say that changes made where there have been votes might well have happened anyway. But I think what Nature on the Board has definitely done is sped up those changes. How can other companies do this, and then is anyone else doing it? Well, we open sourced absolutely everything when we first did it, so they can do it by essentially just following that guide. It's on that URL, faithinnature.co.uk/vote for nature, and it's amazing to see where it lands. The first place it landed was in Cave Creek in Arizona. We got an email from these guys saying, we've just lifted your model completely and implemented it, and they look after an area the size of Grand Canyon, and they're a volunteer organization, so not quite what we expected, but amazing. The next company to come along and say that they wanted to do it properly were House of Hackney, an interior design company in London, and we are speaking to all sorts, charities, now councils, banks, universities. No university yet has done it, by the way, so it's not opportunity. And yeah, I'm sure you have many more questions, which I'd happily answer later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was absolutely fascinating hearing from the different viewpoints. And I'm in a very privileged position because I get to ask my questions first. But please do think about what your questions are going to be, and I will collect the questions from online, and we are monitoring those as well. So Dougie, you're the new member of our panel, so I'm going to ask you first. We've heard a lot about nature being part of decision making, but practically, how would that actually work?
Yeah, good evening, everybody. It's really exciting to be here and see everybody here and everybody online as well. I think it's a really good question, because what we're seeing at the moment is that the landscape out there is becoming cluttered. It's becoming cluttered in a really positive way, in the sense that there's a number of frameworks out there that businesses can actually use to start assessing their impacts on nature, start looking at what they can do about that, looking at the opportunities for those businesses. So I think first thing that they can do is actually choose a framework, what that suits the business, you know, the sector that they're in, the stage they're at, and the way they want to move forward. But I think some people in the room are old enough to remember this. It's a bit kind of like Bananarama and Fun Boy 3. It ain't what you do, it's the way that you do it. So it's not so much the framework, it's how you apply it. So what do we mean by that? Well, it's really, really important that you set targets right at the start. And we've got a business film that came out of the Wild Isles documentaries that Beccy mentioned earlier. And within that, the chief exec of Tesco says, quite simply, you need big, hairy, audacious targets. Business as usual isn't good enough, okay? It's got to, if the business isn't working hard, if it's not difficult to do, then what they're doing isn't going to be enough. So that's another key action that they can take and actually think about the approach that they're doing. Then clearly you've got to think about resources and responsibilities. This is such a big issue, and hopefully you've got that from what Becky said earlier, that you can't just do it on the side of somebody's desk. You can't just give this to somebody else that's already snowed under with other ESG obligations, okay? It's got to be properly resourced, and it's got to have the responsibilities given to people so they understand what they can do. And then on top of that, this is about collaboration as well. This is collaboration within the business, lots of opportunities and lots of benefits you get from that collaboration, but it's also about collaborating with other businesses as well. This isn't do it in isolation. Yes, there are clear competitive reasons to do this, but hopefully you can see that it's bigger than just getting a competitive advantage. It's also about getting change. So collaborate. And then finally, make sure you've got the expertise, okay? I would say that because as head of nature positive economy at RSPB, part of the team that I'm in actually works directly with businesses, a range of businesses who've already taken really, really important steps on this journey to being nature positive. And it's really, really important that they're tapping into that expertise. Okay, I'm an economist, I'm not a scientist, but this is about understanding the science and acting. So this is about species and habitats and making sure that you're actually addressing the problem that is there, and you've got the expertise and understanding to do that.
Yeah,
and then finally, holistically, okay? By all means, plan to do it holistically, get started. Businesses can get started in a certain area. You might start looking at the land and the footprints that a business has, but then think about the money within the organization, the money that is spent through procurement, the money that is invested, okay? Then think about the people. How can they change their behavior? How can they think of solutions in this area? And then really, really importantly, on top of that, Becky mentioned it as well, policy can actually start advocating for the change that's needed, okay? Not just doing it as a business, but politicians can hear from the business sector that this is really, really important, and hopefully you all believe that today, that actually we've got a better chance of getting the change we need. So it's really about being practical and getting stuck in.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Paolo will probably agree with me if I say accountants have a huge role in this because of the way that they present the information that they measure. So do you got anything to add to that about how accountants can influence that business decision making, making sure nature has a voice?
Yeah, there are, I mean, one of the things that I also would like to add to what I said before, I mean, accounting is a paradigm that is different from finance or economics. And so it informs decisions in a different way. Economics is about growth. Finance is about maximizing shareholders' value. Accounting is about balancing things. Those who know me know that I'm particularly interested in the etymology of words. Rationality comes from the Latin ratio, rationality. And ratio in Latin means two things. The first one is proportion. The second one is account, because an account tends to balance things. And so while a finance paradigm would inform decisions that tend to maximize, and this is why it would not be good for nature, because you maximize profit at the expense of nature. You maximize profit at the expense of the human capital. Accounting would actually balance, you know, the remuneration of capital, which is an important thing. I mean, I agree that business is important. I agree exactly or entirely with what you're saying, but would balance that with other interests that the organization has to cater for. So accounting provides a different platform for decision making and for mediation amongst different interests that not necessarily can be aligned, but to be mediated.
Yeah, and the value added income statement that you show is relatively simple compared to an income statement of a usual profit and loss. So I use it a lot in my teaching, especially in my undergraduate teaching, as well as MBA teaching. And I wondered if you had any message for students, because I show it to students and they say that's never going to happen. The old income statement's been around too long. And there's some examples, but I wondered if you'd had any response to that.
Yeah, that income statement has been around for long, but there are other forms that have been around for much longer. That classification of entries by nature, interestingly, and not by function, has been around for 400 years. The classification by function has been around only for less than 100 years. And as I said, last century, by 1980, in Germany, and somehow in Germany they still report with value added. They would report with value added. In Italy, we would report in a way that would be functional to the reclassification of the income statement in value added. So it can be done. There is a need for political willingness of changing things. And maybe if I can add one last thing, why I'm against this idea of separating the calculation of financial returns from the other let's say, measures that have been developed for environmental and societal issues, because this approach of enlarging the real of the measurable keeps the current paradigm absolutely untouched. While if instead you add that line on the income statement, you have to discuss who is going to pay for the reconstitution of the natural capital. Without that, you would have maximization of profit here, and then a few measures there that would be highly political, where like the example of the quality of food, it will be influenced by lobbies, and these measures will leave the current paradigm intact. Yeah. This solution brings the two things together. Yeah. And so you cannot say, okay, I love nature, but yeah, okay, you love nature. But who is going to pay for the reconstitution of natural capital? The workers, the state, the capitalists. Who is going to, that wealth is produced by the organization, is divided amongst these stakeholders. If we have to give something back to nature or reconstitute and regenerate natural capital, someone else has to get less.
Yeah. I presume, Becky, you'd probably agree with that in terms of that loss of diversity and trying to quantify that and seeing that on the balance sheet or in the P&L. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'm interested in two things really. One is how do we capture the value of that? And that is inherently complicated because nature is and ecosystems are complicated. And I think the success of getting climate taken seriously by business, partly it's been about kind of regulation, and we talked earlier on this afternoon about voluntary versus being mandatory. It is a complex thing to value, and I think part of the success of climate getting on there has been about having carbon as a measure, and using that. So I think trying to find a measure for nature positive is really challenging. So I think that's the first thing, and what proxies are we all going to use, et cetera, et cetera. But then the second aspect that I think is really interesting is not just kind of how do you value it for an individual business, but that kind of economic thinking that's going on now, which is what kind of world we want to live in, and is actually all out growth the thing that we're going to stick with, and by that I mean kind of financial return, et cetera, et cetera. GDP is the measure of a country's kind of performance. And I think that new economic thinking is really interesting that's going on at the moment about, things like donut economics, that there are constraints within which we want to grow, but you cannot grow infinitely. And that absolutely ties in with, the idea that nature is not an infinite resource. It has constraints. And I'd be interested actually in any thinking you've done around that. So, having kind of put nature on the board, where are your constraints as a business? Would you grow infinitely, or would you? I'm dying to ask you. So I think that's the other side of the conversation that I think is really interesting.
Go on. You can answer the question.
And we're not at that stage yet.
No.
I don't think of really needing to consider our constraints. We're relatively small.
Yes.
And I think, you know, the degrowth conversation is fascinating. I think it also, looking at it from a larger perspective, there's certainly, well, nature's view on this, by the way, because it is something we've discussed, is that it is not currently in nature's interest to constrain the success of the companies trying to do things in the right way, but rather what you'd hope is that they cannibalize the companies not doing things in the right way. That's kind of, there's a lot more thought around that, but also the reason I think behind why we put nature on the board was not necessarily not as a green police force, but actually as a way of helping us make better decisions, and it's an approach and it's a way of doing things differently.
Yeah.
So, you know, yeah, right now we're taking nature's lead on what is right and what is not, and the whole point of this actually is that we're just not willfully blind going forward. And you know, when you're not willfully blind, you can't just pretend you didn't know. You know what I mean? You make decisions consciously. And I think that's key to it, where we're at.
I do want to ask you the difference between a sustainability director on a board and a nature director on a board.
Sure. So, well, nature as our director is the non-human entity that they're a non-human director.
Yeah.
Technically speaking, sustainability director is human, is employed also by Faith in Nature. They're there to make sure that we hit our targets in a sustainable way according to, you know, whatever metrics are drawn up. What we're trying to get to with nature as a director is a perspective, and perspectives never brought to boardrooms before. And so currently, as a touch upon, they're legal perspectives by necessity. And I think who speaks for nature really guides how nature on the board plays out. But it's drawn up in such a way that there is space there for bringing in poets, for bringing in artists, ecologists, conservationists, indigenous people, whoever might be needed to bring forward just their lived experiences of how it is to live more sustainably.
Yeah.
It is not necessarily the same thing as, I don't think people love SDGs and targets in the same way that people love nature. It's a felt thing rather than a mental thing.
Fantastic. I'm going to have to open out questions a little bit reluctantly, but I am keen to hear what people say. So shall I start with the ones in the room, or have you got any ones? Go on, get Jim's ones online, and then if you can head up to you start up there and then go around. Go on, Jim, what have we got online?
Okay, we've got a couple of very good questions. The first one probably for Beccy and Simeon. What experiences have you had of influencing executives in other organizations to take nature / SDGs more seriously? And also what works in practice? And then I'll ask second one as well. Is there some third-party organization that grades businesses according to their inclusion of nature in their business practices? The first one was about, what experiences you've had of influencing executives.
So I think up until relatively recently, I would say it's been driven by individuals. So it's been, somebody like you or your stepmom, or, it's been a passionate individual who's ended up in a position of power in an organization, has decided we're going to do something about this, and would then come and talk to us or talk to, a fellow organization and kind of build some sort of relationship and start kind of taking nature much more seriously in the decisions they're making. I think what's interesting now is I think there is a growing recognition of the scale of risk for any business in the current kind of climate and biodiversity crisis. So that, whatever business you're in, if you have investors, you need to be kind of looking at that risk that is out there for you and deciding to do something about it. And I think that's the kind of tipping point I think is going on, so that other businesses who perhaps don't have a particularly passionate individual are starting to take that very seriously, driven sometimes by their investors, driven sometimes by their consumers, if they're a very consumer-facing business, and driven also just by good strategic planning for the business, realizing that they need to tackle this. Now, then taking those steps and deciding what form that takes, and and so on and so forth, is a different thing. But I'm seeing a lot more of that happening, I think, and certainly the Save Our Wild Isles films that you mentioned, we did some business focused films on the back of the Wild Isles series, you know, we've had a really high take up on people wanting to use those in their businesses to kind of drive that conversation and start that conversation. So I think definitely I'm seeing more and more of that happening.
Paolo, would you agree in terms of when you're talking to businesses around your different way of showing the accounting numbers? Do you see that more businesses are taking up, or is it down to a few enthusiastic individuals?
I would agree with Becky. It's a bit of a mix. I mean, we had, for instance, this case of this enlightened individual who was the CFO of this large estate German company that said, "Oh, I want to do it," and then the other said no. But I think that there is, I mean, this idea of nature as a stakeholder is popping up in so many conversations. And your slide where you showed all of these different articles, I mean, is a testimony to that eventually I think a solution has to emerge. And I don't think that the solutions that are emerging at the moment, you know, make that, you know, make nature as a stakeholder so clear. If you think of, you know, IWSB, for instance, I mean, the plan for having standard sustainability reports is still made in the interest of shareholders, and not in the interest of the wider community, not in the interest of common good, which is what we discussed earlier. And so eventually these things will have to be addressed.
What was the second question again, Jim?
Was if there's some third-party organisation which grades businesses according to their inclusion of nature?
Simeon, are you up for that? A grading according to?
I don't know. I have no idea.
Would you be up for doing that in your spare time?
I hesitate to say yes, but at the beginning of this whole thing, actually, we wondered whether or not, when launching Nature on Board, whether or not it should be something that, does there need to be some kite mark? Does there need to be, who was the regulator of this sort of idea? And it was so sort of early days, actually, that we felt the open source method of hopefully just, you know, you cross your fingers and hope people take it seriously and other people receive it warmly. Eventually, other people adopt these sorts of ideas. And in the true spirit of open sourceness, that it becomes self-policing. I think that's kind of where we're still at, but I don't know whether or not such a body exists.
I mean, I think greenwashing is a big issue, right? So, you know, it happens. We can probably all think of examples where we've kind of think we're seeing greenwashing. And B, I think companies that want to do something and want to take it seriously are now a bit scared of being accused of greenwashing, right? So I think it's a real inhibitor. So, and the only way in which you can kind of do something about that whole issue is to have a level playing field and to have more regulation, less voluntary kind of codes of practice, you know, more consistency, you know, trying to kind of stop things like, you know, carbon credits being a complete kind of Wild West scenario, which it sort of is at the moment. That's the only way in which you're going to really kind of get that sorted out. And then you can have, you know, some kind of ranking that really means something. I think greenwashing is a really big issue both ways.
Yeah, I was just going to say there is a task force on nature-related financial disclosures which exists, and in the last 2 years that framework has come from the start right the way through to something that's published at the moment with recommendations. Now, it's not quite getting to the point that you're saying, because as Becky's saying, it's still actually voluntary. But actually, if that was applied in a holistic way, then you would be able to start to assess what businesses were doing and where they were actually graded. So I don't think we're a million miles away from that type of approach. We're moving quite quickly, and it would be really, really good that if people could just actually look and say, I'm dealing with a business, I'm buying from a business, I want to see what the grading is, and I want to understand it. So I think hopefully we can get there somewhere like that in the future. But it really requires everybody to be asking for it. That comes back to that kind of policy point. You know, consumers have got to be asking for it when we go out and buy. Businesses have got to be responding to consumers. Businesses have got to be asking businesses for it as well to get that kind of momentum behind it.
Yeah,
it's why, by the way, I can just also say, it's why, by the way, also the report or the reporting aspect of Nature on the Board is so important, because, you know, we realized fairly early on that if you could just say you put Nature on the Board, but then just retreat back into your shell and never provide any evidence, then you know, exactly. It's completely open to greenwashing.
Yeah.
And so in that report, it says that if somebody says they have done, but they don't produce a report like this, I'd really encourage you to question why. And also that in itself is a rights of nature approach to looking at business. Like if nature has all these rights, well, one of those rights should be that you get to really interrogate whether or not companies that say they're doing their bit by nature are really doing. So, you know, we're trying to figure out what the rights of nature mean within the business world. But yeah, that's why that report matters so much.
Absolutely. Okay, I've got some very keen hands up in the room. Do you want to, can you go to the middle here? And then I'll come back to there. You're very keen to ask a question. Go.
Thank you. Thank you so much for really interesting talks and an excellent panel so far. My name is Eleanor Akers. I'm the Director of Innovative Energy Consultants. We're a strategy and sustainability consultancy. And my question is really sparked by Paolo's income statement. It's got nature as a line item, but as everybody has alluded to already, it's very difficult to quantify positive impact on nature. Just because you've spent money doesn't mean there's been a positive effect. Just because you bought a carbon credit doesn't, sadly, mean that you've actually captured any carbon. Does anyone on the panel have any thoughts around whether it's really appropriate to be trying to summarize nature as a line item on an income statement? And if so, how could we be doing this in a way that is meaningful and comparable?
Yeah, I'm going to start with Paolo. Yeah,
exactly.
yeah, absolutely.
I think that the word you're using is, if I may say, wrong. It's not measurement; it's a reflection. So these things, all the measures are subject to subjectivity and relativity. This is why we've got standards, right? But that line would force, you know, greater disclosure. So as exactly Simeon was saying, you know, one thing is to say, oh, I put nature on the board. One other thing is actually to disclose what that means. And so that will force companies to disclose what that means. That would force the users of the accounts to ask for what that number, which is absolutely relative and subjective, means and is calculated. So it's not a measurement. It becomes a space of dialogue and a space of discussion. In that sense, that is a form of governance. The form of governance based on measurement presupposes that things are objective. This is why you got auditors in the Anglo-American tradition. In the non-Anglo-American tradition, we didn't have auditors because there is not a truth to be certified. There is a number to be discussed in the General Assembly where you have tensions between different stakeholders, and the truth emerges in that discussion. So I think and that is what I wanted to say with the enlargement of the realm of the measurement. It's a multiplication of the wrong approach to the problem. The approach to the problem is that notions of value are very complicated, and you cannot really solve them by you know, ticking boxes and say, oh, I've reported on these three key targets that I had to report, and I'm now fine. That actually creates more opacity rather than transparency, I would argue.
And just want to let Beccy have a response to that as well, about this line of nature. How do you feel about that in the RSPB account?
Great question. So I think, I mean, just to be really clear, the RSPB, we think there is absolutely an intrinsic value to nature, you know, and we talk a lot about kind of a moral obligation and future generations and how we kind of think about nature and how we kind of plan our work. And we think we should be kind of looking after nature because we are beholden to do that, I suppose. But we also think that you have to engage with the kind of modern systems in which we find ourselves, and therefore, you know, we have to think about the extrinsic value of nature, which is the ecosystems that we all depend on. I think, you know, how you kind of measure that and put that onto something like a balance sheet, it's really challenging. The thing, I've got two models that I would suggest. One is looking at the work that's been done in the global biodiversity framework, which was the, you know, Kunming Montreal conversation just over a year ago, and that, you know, very much broke it down into kind of, you know, habitat protection, creation, restoration. It broke it down into species and how species are doing. And you have to kind of look at some of those measurable kind of outcomes around how nature is doing. The other thing I think is really interesting is its intactness. So how intact are the ecosystems in which you are engaging as a business, and what is your impact on that kind of intactness measure? And we're seeing that used more and more. I mean, I talked about it in my opening remarks, so I think that's really interesting. I think until we get something agreed around the proxies we're going to use, it is very difficult. But I think we can get there. I think we have the data and we have the knowledge to get there. But yeah, it is challenging. It is definitely challenging. And I would not want to lose that sense of the intrinsic value of nature as well as the extrinsic.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
Can I come to this gentleman here who thought he was going to get the microphone but didn't quite?
Thank you. Yeah, question for the panel, just following on from what Simeon said about the person in the business who said, what's ESG? Because it was redundant to them, because it was from their heart within the business. I would speculate, though, the majority of businesses, and there are what, 99% of businesses in the UK are SMEs, that they don't have a heart. Not because they're mean and nasty, but because they've got so many other things to worry about. So on that basis, how do you get those businesses to the table at all?
That's a big question for you.
Well, you are an SME. You are an SME.
Yeah, we are an SME for a start.
And they can do it.
And what I would say is that it is so surprising that the companies that are responding well to this, that we were just never necessarily, like I said, banks, and certainly not SME, but tons of SMEs coming forward. When they realize that, as I said earlier, that this is not some sort of thing to beat ourselves with, but actually this is a tool to help us make better, greener decisions. I think when that penny drops, they're realizing that maybe there might be something really valuable in this for them, because, speaking of our experience of faith in nature, even though we're well-meaning and we have heart and all the rest of it, we could still spend, and there's some of the faith in nature team there, by the way, who will, testify this, but we could spend like hours, weeks, months, years going over the same topics over and over again, when suddenly you realize that you can bring in, external specialists with different perspectives to help you actually just realize what the best route forward is. That makes things more efficient and quicker, so maybe that's what SMEs and lots of people with that heart need, is just to understand that it's a tool.
Paolo, have you got anything?
Yeah, very, very quickly. I would actually revert your comment, because if you look at for instance, UK corporate code, it forces the big corporation to pursue shareholders' value. And so what this does is to make a confusion between means, money, with ends. And so means become ends in themselves. And so big corporations pursue means for the sake of means, if you see what I mean. In the small SMEs, you have passion. You have, the small companies, they are proud of what they do. So money is a means to pursue ends, and the two things are separated. And so I would revert your argument and say, actually, there is much greater hope in the SMEs than in the big corporations.
Brilliant. We only have 5 minutes or so left, and I do want to take one more question from online, but I'll just take one more in the room and then I'll come to you, Jim, if that's okay.
You've been talking about individual businesses. Do you see this a way to get this into government accounting? The HS2?
That's the sole point in Manchester.
Yeah, or even more, gross domestic product. Isn't that a problem with the way we run our affairs?
Becky,
I'm going to hand to the expert.
Yeah.
Sounds like an economist.
Sounds like an economist question.
Yeah.
That's easy.
Do you know, government does have some of the frameworks that it needs to get nature properly into decision making. But if we're being quite frank, it doesn't use them properly. So they have a whole appraisal framework for which they make decisions. It's called the Green Book. And within that, there is a chapter on natural capital and the environment. So in theory, when the governments are making decisions, they have the tools available to compare, say, investment in road infrastructure with investment in natural capital. And hopefully, if they did that in a meaningful way, you might see that the investment in natural capital is going to pay much more returns over the longer term. But actually, it's just not used properly. So some of the thinking is there, and it's actually getting governments to use it. We saw a few weeks ago one of the big economic statements of the year, the autumn statement. Nature wasn't mentioned, and it was, and that's despite the fact, as Beccy said, that is a Treasury document, obviously coming from the politicians, and it was the Treasury that commissioned the Dasgupta review on the economics of biodiversity. So there is some appetite there. We need to just push them harder, and we need to ask the right questions. And again, that comes back to where it's a collective decision.
Yeah, Paolo?
Yeah, very, very quickly. It's a wonderful question, and I'm an amateur historian, and so I do a lot of accounting history. This idea of the provision for nature comes from some of this historical work, in particular recent historical work. And so there is a large public holding in Italy that was the holding that administered the funds of the Marshall Plan in Italy after the Second World War. Which was linked to the state because it was owned by the state. Its name was IRI, along with ENI, ENI, and Enel. So IRI was industry and banks, ENI, oil and gas, and Enel, electricity. They reported and they planned and budgeted according to value added. And the Italian state was the first one, or amongst the first one, in the world where the national accounting was done with value added. And in many countries, national accounting is still done with value added. And what they did was actually to link national accounting with public holding accounting with subsidiaries that operate in the market with value added. All the things went up and down. The Italian economic miracle was done with value added, not with profit.
I think we've got time for one more question online.
You got time? Yeah.
Go, yeah.
We've got a comment and a question. I'll just start with the comment. The comment picks up on the point that Paolo made before about reversing that comment that was made in the audience about SMEs. One of our professors, Simon Hayward, has made a comment. It's really not right to say SMEs cannot have a heart or act responsibly. Quite the opposite, in my experience. I'll add that in. The one question that's come in is regards the barriers. So just asking, can our panelists speak to their experience of the barriers they've overcome to culture change in their own organizations in reference to nature and sustainability?
So Simeon, can I come to you first, then I'll come to you, Beccy. So Simeon, when you think about your previous life as well, what barriers have you overcome to put nature on the board? It can't have been an easy road.
Surprisingly, actually, it was. Like in the company that I was in, I love this quote about finding your puzzle piece. Like that we all get to sort of play our part, and you spoke about individuals, opportunities to change and affect change, and it was just realization really that our puzzle piece was being on a company board, not necessarily having chased that position. We were just in that position, and then realizing that, wait a second, the opportunity given to us here is huge, because knowing that the founders are closely, clearly, and knowing the type of company it was, when we realized that this was an idea that could be made reality, it didn't take much convincing of the board. However, I do know that the companies that follow us they've had battles, and they have overcome them. And there's been a lot of education and a lot of bringing people along on that journey. And the point about SMEs is absolutely right. I think that there is so much will with so many of the people that we meet. Many of them obviously have private equity investors and all sorts of other perhaps barriers. But I think with the process of education of why this is so absolutely necessary, those barriers will fall by the wayside, hopefully quickly.
Excellent. And Beccy?
I'll answer the question, and I'm going to reverse it, because that's been an interesting journey for us as the RSPB. So I think, on the business side and overcoming barriers, I think the things that I see kind of having impact now are probably kind of investor pressure. I think that's starting to happen a bit. I think consumer pressure is definitely starting to happen. And I think we were talking about this earlier, employees. So I think there are, the kind of organizations that are employing younger people coming through to work for them. And a lot of those people want their business to take these issues really seriously. And I think that pressure is really having an impact. So I think that's only going to grow. The way which I was going to reverse it was to say in the RSPB, of course, the issue is taking business seriously as a way to kind of, trying to make the natural world a better place, because that's what we're obsessed by. And I think that's been a really interesting journey, and realizing, I think, the organization realizing that if we really want to affect change at scale, which is what we need to do now, then we have to work with everyone, and that businesses can move a lot faster than governments in driving this sort of change. Yeah. So we really need to work with business to get this to happen. And I think that's definitely a growing kind of route for us in terms of achieving, a thriving natural world, which is what we want to see, where people and nature live in harmony. Yeah.
Can I also just add to that?
You have to be brief now. You have to be brief now.
I'm aware of one investor who is now saying to any companies that he might invest in that they must put nature on the board before he invests, and that's massive.
Yeah.
Now finance is on board too. So
my very last question before I hand back to Ken and we finish this evening is about what are your hopes for the future? So thinking either fairly short term or longer term, what are your hopes for the future in terms of nature and its role within business? I'll start with Paolo and we'll go along the board and then I shall pass to you.
I know we're late, so I'll be very rapid. I hope that accounting saves the world.
obviously, I hope more organizations and companies put nature on their board, but actually, I think even before that, that those people all people actually develop an understanding of the rights of nature discourse. Because once you really understand that, ideas flow from it. Nature on the board is just one execution of the big idea, which is actually the rights of nature. And it's the rights of nature stuff I think people really need to get their heads around, and it's fascinating. So if you're not already literate, get your heads around it.
Becky.
I think for me, it's about scale and urgency. So that's how bad the situation is now. The only thing change at scale and only urgent change is going to make the difference. And I think once you're talking about scale and urgency, then you're talking about business. So I do feel quite hopeful that businesses are waking up to this and will make the difference that we need and play their part.
Yeah, I think for me it's about action, and I was going to say it's about getting the economic framework right, but it's simpler than that. It's actually getting action to generate the change. And to finish quoting a famous economist, John Maynard Keynes, famously referenced that at one point in time we were getting things precisely wrong, and it's much better to get things broadly right, and that's the thing that we need, the action and the change to drive forward.
Brilliant. And I'm hopeful also that accountants will say that, because all my accounting students then will be inspired by you, go on and put nature on the board and make some significant changes. So big thank you to our board panel. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks so much to our audience, both in the room and online, for their stimulating questions. Thanks so much too to our panel for their insightful comments. You will find on your tables a copy of our research magazine, and within that you will actually find articles by both Beccy and Paolo. Our topic of that whole issue is around about trying to recognise nature. So my own personal journey began a very, very many years ago with this issue when I read Rachel Carson's Silent Spring as when I was doing my PhD. I think what really has changed in my mind since then, and I was really encouraged to hear Becky's summing up, is the fundamentally positive role that business can play in addressing these challenges. And that's really what we want to be the catalyst for here in AMBS as we grapple with these grand challenges and come up with some solutions. And again, it's brilliant to see companies that are actually doing this in their day-to-day action. I was reading an article recently with the Financial Times that was talking about the crisis in imagination within business schools and businesses. And I think what we've had articulated for us is just people who've taken that spark of a question, allowed it to ignite their imagination, to ask new questions and come up with new ideas for the future of value and business. So I found it hugely stimulating. I hope you have too, and I'd like us to thank our panelists with one final round of applause. So thank you very much.